Colorado Territory, 1881. A woman stands alone as the stagecoach disappears into the distance, dust settling around her trunk and valise. Her gloved fingers grip a faded daguerreotype of a man she's never met, her intended husband awaiting her. A rival. Her weary eyes scan the town's single street, expecting bustling life, but finding only abandoned buildings with broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. As realization dawns that she has journeyed across the country to a ghost town, she understands that fate has dealt her an unexpected hand. What follows will test not only her resolve, but reveal that sometimes our greatest strength emerges from the ruins of our carefully laid plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter March wind cut through Vivian Montgomery's woolen, traveling coat as she stood motionless in the center of what should have been Silverdale, a supposedly thriving mining settlement nestled in Colorado's San Juan Mountains. 26 years old, with chestnut hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet and eyes the color of mountain heather, she carried herself with the dignified bearing of a woman who had weathered life's storms with quiet fortitude. The stagecoach that had deposited her here was now nothing more than a distant cloud of dust on the horizon, leaving her utterly alone in a town that seemed to have been abandoned months ago. Storefronts stood with doors hanging from broken hinges, glass windows shattered, and not a single soul in sight. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the surrounding mountains. Only the whistling wind answered. Vivian retrieved a letter from her reticule, its creases well worn from countless readings during her 2-week journey from Philadelphia. Silverdale, Colorado Territory, a growing community with promising silver deposits and need of civilizing. Influences, wrote Thomas Graham, the man whose advertisement she had answered 6 months prior. His letters had described a modest but comfortable home, a respectable position as the town's assayer, and a community eager to welcome a schoolteacher, which Vivian had been in Philadelphia until circumstances forced her hasty departure. "This can't be right," she murmured, glancing again at the letter to confirm the location, but there was no mistake. This was indeed Silverdale, or rather, what remained of it. Steeling herself against rising panic, Vivian lifted her valise and began walking down the main street, searching for any sign of life. The 2-story building marked Silverdale Hotel seemed the most intact structure. Perhaps someone remained who could explain this ghostly scene. The hotel lobby was thick with dust, furniture overturned, as though the occupants had left in great haste. A ledger lay open on the reception desk, entries stopping abruptly 3 months earlier, in December. Vivian traced her finger along the final notations, which read simply, "Mine collapse. Town meeting called." A sound from upstairs, subtle but distinct, froze her in place. The creak of a floorboard beneath a cautious step. "Is someone there?" she called, her hand slipping into her pocket where she kept a small derringer pistol, a parting gift from her brother before his departure for the Prussian War. "I mean no harm. I'm looking for Thomas Graham." Silence, then the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Thomas Graham is dead," came a deep voice from the shadows of the staircase, along with most everyone else who called this place home. A man descended slowly into view, each deliberate step revealing more of his imposing figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a dust-covered duster over trail-worn clothes. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his features, but couldn't conceal the week's growth of beard on his face or the wary assessment in his dark eyes. Most notably, a 6-shooter remained steadily trained on Vivian's midsection. "Who might you be, ma'am, arriving in a dead town with no one to meet you?" His voice carried the rough edges of someone accustomed to hard living, but with an underlying education that surprised her. Vivian straightened her spine, refusing to show fear despite the weapon pointed at her. Vivian Montgomery. I was to marry Mr. Graham upon my arrival. Clearly that won't be happening now. Something flickered across the stranger's face. Surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect at her composure. The gun lowered slightly. Daniel Blackwood, he offered, though the name came with obvious reluctance. You've had a wasted journey, Miss Montgomery. Silver played out 6 months ago. The main mine collapsed in December, killed 15 men, including your intended. Most everyone else packed up and left for more promising claims. The blunt delivery of Thomas Graham's fate struck Vivian with unexpected force. Not grief for a man she'd never met, but the sudden collapse of her carefully constructed escape plan. I see, she managed, her mind racing through rapidly diminishing options. Her funds were depleted from the journey west. The nearest town was Helena's Crossing, at least 2 days' travel on foot through mountain terrain, and the stagecoach wouldn't return for another week. There's nothing for you here, Blackwood continued, finally holstering his weapon as he apparently decided. She posed no threat. Next coach comes through on Thursday. Best you return east. And until Thursday? Vivian asked, practical concerns momentarily overshadowing the larger catastrophe of her situation. Blackwood studied her thoughtfully, taking in her traveling dress of serviceable navy wool, the sensible boots visible beneath her hem, the determined set of her jaw. Not the typical Eastern lady seeking adventure in the territories, his expression seemed to say. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There's rooms upstairs that are still habitable. I've been using one while I... He hesitated. Finish some business in town. You didn't leave with the others? Vivian asked, curiosity temporarily overriding caution. A shadow passed across Blackwood's weathered face. Had my reasons to arrive late and leave last. Something in his tone warned against further questions. Instead, Vivian glanced toward the stairs. I would appreciate shelter until the coach returns. I can pay a reasonable sum. Keep your money, he replied gruffly. Not much use in a ghost town. As Blackwood turned to retrieve her trunk from outside, Vivian caught sight of something she'd missed initially. A wanted poster, partially visible in his coat pocket, the corner of which displayed a reward, amount of 500. The realization that she was alone in an abandoned town with a likely outlaw should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm. After all, she was no stranger to dangerous men or desperate circumstances. The hotel room Blackwood showed her to was simple but relatively clean. A bed with a faded quilt, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a small writing desk beneath a window overlooking the empty main street. There's a pump out back that still works, he explained from the doorway, maintaining a respectful distance. Stove in the kitchen too, if you're inclined to cook. Some preserved goods in the pantry. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Vivian set her valise on the bed, acutely aware of how her plans had collapsed, like the mine that claimed her intended husband's life. How long have you been here alone? His expression remained guarded. Few weeks. Checking for anything salvageable. Before moving on. Salvageable, Vivian repeated, moving to the window to gaze out at the deserted town. From this vantage point, she could see perhaps 24 buildings in various states of abandonment. A church steeple rose at the far end of the street, while several smaller structures, homes, she presumed, dotted the hillside behind the main thoroughfare. Place was evacuated too quickly, Blackwood elaborated unexpectedly. Some folks left valuables behind. Others might return eventually, when memories of the tragedy fade. Vivian turned back to face him, noting how he filled the doorframe with his imposing presence. Despite his rough appearance and the wanted poster in his pocket, he'd shown her nothing but gruff courtesy thus far. And the mine itself? Northern. Entrance collapsed completely. Southern tunnel still accessible, but unstable. 20 men died in the initial cave-in, including your Mr. Graham. 5 more trying to rescue them. The detached way he delivered this information suggested a man accustomed to death, yet something in his eyes, a fleeting shadow of empathy perhaps, hinted at deeper currents beneath the stoic exterior. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, turning to go. "I keep to the room at the end of the hall. Lock your door at night, Miss Montgomery. Just because the town seems empty doesn't mean it is." After Blackwood's footsteps faded, Vivian sank onto the edge of the bed, the full weight of her situation finally settling on her shoulders. She'd fled Philadelphia with barely enough money for the journey and a desperate plan to start anew as Mrs. Thomas Graham. Now she was stranded in a ghost town with a man who was almost certainly wanted by the law. From her valise, she withdrew a small leather-bound journal, the most precious of her few possessions. Inside were carefully preserved newspaper clippings, letters, and her own detailed notes documenting the financial crimes and political corruption of Senator William Preston, one of Philadelphia's most powerful men. Evidence that had gotten her brother killed and forced her into hiding when Preston's men came looking for her in the journal. The mail-order arrangement with Thomas Graham had been her salvation, a chance to disappear where Preston's influence couldn't reach. Now that escape route had vanished like morning mist, leaving her stranded and vulnerable once more. Exhaustion from her journey and the shock of her circumstances soon overtook her. Despite her intention to merely rest for a moment, Vivian fell into a deep sleep, still fully dressed atop the faded quilt. She awoke hours later to darkness and the delicious aroma of coffee. For a disoriented moment, she thought herself back in Philadelphia, in the small apartment she'd shared with her brother James. Then reality rushed back as she registered the unfamiliar room and the memory of her arrival in the abandoned Silverdale. A lamp had been lit on her writing desk, beside it a mug of steaming coffee and a plate with beans and what appeared to be biscuits. Blackwood must have entered while she slept, a thought that should have disturbed her more than it did. The meal, simple but hot, reminded her that she hadn't eaten since morning. As she took her first bite, a folded paper beneath the plate caught her attention. Opening it revealed a roughly sketched map of Silverdale with buildings clearly marked. General store, assay office, livery, church and others. At the bottom, in a surprisingly elegant hand, was written, "Town's deserted but not empty. Stay within sight of hotel." The warning, cryptic as it was, sent a chill through her. What dangers lurked in the abandoned buildings? Wolves? Claim? Jumpers? Or something related to whatever business kept a wanted man lingering in a ghost town? Morning brought pale sunlight streaming through the hotel window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Vivian had slept fitfully, startled awake several times by unfamiliar sounds. The settling of the abandoned building, the howl of wind through broken windows, and once what sounded distinctly like voices from the direction of the mine. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a practical brown wool with minimal bustle, suitable for the rigors of frontier life. If she was to be stranded for days in this ghost town, she would at least explore her surroundings in daylight. The hotel's dining room was empty, though a fresh pot of coffee sat on the wood stove, suggesting Blackwood had already been up and about. Helping herself to a cup, Vivian stepped onto the hotel's covered porch and surveyed the main street in the clear morning light. Silverdale had once been a handsome settlement. The buildings, though hastily constructed as most mining towns were, showed signs of prosperity and permanence that made its abandonment all the more poignant. The assay office directly across the street featured a painted glass window, now cracked, but still impressive. Further down stood a dressmaker's shop, a barber shop, and what appeared to be a small newspaper office. Most left within a week of the collapse, Blackwood's voice came from behind her, causing her to start slightly. For such a large man, he moved with surprising stealth. Those who stayed cleared out when typhoid hit in January. Bad water from the mine seepage. Vivian turned to face him. In daylight, she could better see the details of his appearance. Perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and a face weathered by sun and hardship. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his beard. Despite his rough exterior, his eyes, deep brown and watchful, revealed intelligence and something that might have been regret. "You said Thomas Graham was the town assayer," she said, gesturing toward the building across the street. "That would have been my home." Blackwood followed her gaze. Graham was well respected, honest, which isn't always the case with assayers, had a small apartment above his office, simple but comfortable enough. The personal detail about her intended husband brought a strange pang, not grief exactly, how could one grieve a stranger? But mourning for the life that might have been, the security she'd sought. "I'd like to see it," Vivian decided. "His home. What would have been my home?" Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close. Some buildings aren't structurally sound anymore." As they crossed the empty street together, Vivian became aware of how their footsteps echoed in the unnatural silence. No birdsong, no distant voices or clanging from the mine, no horses or wagons, just the whisper of wind through abandoned buildings. "Why did you really stay behind, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked suddenly. "And don't tell me it's for salvage." A man with a wanted poster in his pocket doesn't linger in one place without good reason. His stride faltered momentarily, but he didn't deny her observation about the poster. "Perceptive of you, Miss Montgomery. Necessity has made me observant." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Has it now? And what necessity would drive a Philadelphia lady to marry a man she's never met in a remote mining town?" The direct question startled her. "How did you know I'm from Philadelphia?" "Your trunk has a shipping label from the Philadelphia Continental Rail Line, and your accent, subtle as it is, places you from the eastern Pennsylvania region." Now it was Vivian's turn to be impressed by his observations. Perhaps they were both hiding more than they revealed. "We all have our reasons for seeking new beginnings, Mr. Blackwood," she replied diplomatically. "Indeed we do," he acknowledged, letting the subject drop as they reached the assay office door. The interior of Thomas Graham's workplace was surprisingly intact. Scales for weighing ore samples sat on a solid oak desk. Shelves lined with reference books on mineralogy and geology covered one wall. Chemical apparatus for testing ore purity stood on a workbench beneath a window that would have provided good light. "He was educated," Vivian observed, running her finger along book spines that included works in German and French. "Yale," Blackwood confirmed. "Came west after the war. Brought civilization with him, folks said." A narrow staircase at the back led to the living quarters above. The apartment was modest, but would have been comfortable for a couple beginning their life together. A small sitting area with 2 chairs flanking a cast-iron stove, a kitchen alcove with shelves for provisions, and a bedroom with a handmade quilt still draped across the bed frame, now layered with dust. On the bedside table sat a daguerreotype in a silver frame, a formal portrait of a man in his 40s with a scholarly appearance, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a neatly trimmed beard. Thomas Graham, the husband who would never be. "He looked kind," Vivian said softly, touching the frame. "He was," Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting personal knowledge. "Too kind for his own good sometimes." Vivian glanced up, curious. "You knew him well?" A shadow passed across Blackwood's face. "Well enough. Small town." He turned toward the window, effectively ending that line of conversation. "There's a root cellar below the building. Graham stored his personal effects there, safer from weather and animals. Might be some things you'd want to claim as his intended. The practicality of this suggestion pulled Vivian from her contemplation of what might have been. Yes, I'd appreciate that. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the office floor. Blackwood lit a lantern and led the way down narrow stairs into the cool darkness below. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved foods, bottles of chemicals used in assaying, and several locked strongboxes. Graham kept his valuables here. Blackwood indicated the largest of the strongboxes. Don't know if you have a key or... I do, Vivian interrupted, pulling a small key from her reticule. He sent it in his last letter, said his business papers would be secured here, and I should have access as his wife. The key fit perfectly, the lock turning with a satisfying click. Inside, Vivian found neatly bundled documents, property deeds, bank statements, and personal correspondence. A velvet pouch contained a simple gold wedding band that would have been hers. Beneath these lay a leather-bound journal similar to her own. Looks like your Mr. Graham left you reasonably well provided for, Blackwood observed, his tone neutral. That deeds for this building and another property outside town. Bank statement shows an account in Denver with about $800. Vivian looked up sharply. You seem very familiar with Mr. Graham's personal affairs. Blackwood's expression remained unreadable. Just making an observation based on what I can see. But something in his manner suggested more, a knowledge too intimate for casual acquaintance. Vivian slipped the journal into her pocket, while returning the other documents to the box. Whatever secrets Thomas Graham had kept, she would discover them in private. As they emerged from the root cellar, a sound from outside caught their attention. The distant but unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. Blackwood's hand immediately went to his holstered revolver. Were you expecting company, Mr. Blackwood? Vivian asked quietly. Never expect company in a ghost town, Miss Montgomery. His expression had hardened, the momentary openness of their exploration replaced by vigilant wariness. And it's rarely the welcome kind. He moved to the window, positioning himself to see without being easily spotted. 4 riders, heavily armed, coming from the North Trail. The law, Vivian suggested, though something in his tense posture told her otherwise. Not likely, Blackwood replied grimly. Sheriff from Helena's Crossing wears a badge, not a red. A bandana. He turned to her with sudden urgency. You need to hide, now. Who are they? Men who'll have questions I don't want to answer. He gestured toward the root cellar. Down there, lock it from inside. Don't come out no matter what you hear. The command in his voice brooked no argument. Vivian descended the stairs quickly, pulling the trapdoor closed above her. The lock mechanism could indeed be secured from either side, a design feature that now seemed ominously purposeful. In the dim light, filtering through cracks in the floorboards above, Vivian settled on a crate, Thomas Graham's journal clutched in her hands. Above, she could hear Blackwood, moving purposefully around the office, then the sound of the front door closing as he presumably left to confront the approaching riders. Left alone in the shadows, Vivian opened the journal, hoping to find some explanation for the current circumstances. The neat, precise handwriting matched the letters she had received, confirming at least that her correspondence had indeed been with Thomas Graham himself. The entries began 3 years prior, documenting the establishment of Silverdale and Graham's position as assayer. Routine observations about ore quality, town development, and personal reflections filled the early pages. But about 8 months ago, the tone changed dramatically. Discovered discrepancies in the North Star mine assays today, read an entry from July. The official samples showing declining silver content don't match my private tests. Someone is deliberately misrepresenting the mine's productivity. Must investigate further before approaching the investors. Subsequent entries detailed Graham's growing suspicion of fraud involving the mine owners, town officials, and investors from Denver. His final entry, dated just 3 days before the mine collapse that claimed his life, sent a chill through Vivian. Confronted Jackson about the fraudulent assays. He denied everything but couldn't explain the discrepancies, threatened to expose the scheme to the Denver investors, meeting tonight with someone who claims to have proof of who's behind it all. If anything happens to me, the evidence is hidden, where only B would know to look. B. The initial lingered in Vivian's mind as she closed the journal. Could it refer to Blackwood? And what was the evidence Graham had hidden? Her contemplation was interrupted by voices directly above. Blackwood had returned to the office, and he wasn't alone. Through the floorboards, their conversation reached her in fragments. "Search the whole town," a rough voice was saying. "Must have moved on." "Told you," came Blackwood's measured response. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description." "Boss won't be happy," another voice growled. "That woman has something that belongs to him." Vivian's breath caught. Were they looking for her specifically? How could anyone know she had come to Silverdale? "Your boss's problems aren't mine," Blackwood replied coldly. "I'm just passing through, same as you." A derisive laugh. "Passing through with a price on your head, Blackwood. Might be worth more to us to bring you in than keep looking for some Eastern lady with a journal." The journal. They were after her evidence against Senator Preston. Somehow his reach had extended even to this remote ghost town. But how had they tracked her? "You're welcome to try." Blackwood's voice had dropped dangerously. "But I guarantee 2 of you won't leave Silverdale alive. Your choice, which 2? The tension in the room above was palpable, even through the floorboards. For several heartbeats, silence reigned. Then, "We'll be watching the trails," the first voice warned, "both for you and the woman. Boss says she might be coming here to meet someone. Fancy Eastern lady with chestnut hair, traveling alone." "I'll keep an eye out," Blackwood replied dryly. "Now, unless you're planning to draw against me, I suggest you ride out while the day's still young." The heavy tread of boots crossed the office floor, followed by the sound of the door closing. Vivian remained motionless, straining to hear any further conversation. Instead, she heard Blackwood's footsteps return to the trapdoor, followed by 3 sharp knocks. "They're gone," he called, "for now." When Vivian emerged from the root cellar, she found Blackwood leaning against the assay desk, his expression troubled. "Those men," she began, "they were looking for me. Seems that—" "Wait," he agreed, studying her with new interest. "Care to explain why armed riders would track a mail-order bride to an abandoned mining town?" Vivian hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Trust came difficult after what she'd experienced in Philadelphia, yet circumstances had thrust them together in this precarious situation. "I believe they work for Senator William Preston of Pennsylvania," she finally said. "A man with considerable power and even more substantial secrets." "Political secrets," Blackwood surmised. "Political and criminal." Vivian withdrew her journal from her pocket. "My brother James was Preston's personal secretary. He discovered evidence of bribery, misappropriation of government funds, and worse. Before he could take the evidence to the authorities, he was found dead, an apparent suicide that was anything but. Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes. "And you have this evidence now. Everything James collected, plus what I gathered afterward." She held the journal tightly, her only leverage against a man who had already taken so much from her. "Preston's men came for me next. I barely escaped Philadelphia with my life. The mail-order arrangement with Thomas Graham was my attempt to disappear." "Only to find yourself in another dangerous situation," Blackwood observed grimly. "Yes," Vivian agreed, then paused as realization struck. "Though I'm curious how Preston's men knew to look for me here, in a town that's supposedly been abandoned for months." Blackwood's expression revealed nothing, but his hand moved subtly closer to his holstered revolver. That is curious. The tension between them shifted, charged suddenly with suspicion. "Mr. Blackwood," Vivian said carefully, "you seem very familiar with Thomas Graham's affairs. You knew about his education, his character, even the contents of his strongbox. Are you truly just passing through Silverdale?" For a long moment, Blackwood remained silent, his dark eyes assessing her as if weighing a decision. Finally, he straightened from the desk and reached slowly into his coat, withdrawing not a weapon but a folded document. "Thomas Graham was my cousin," he said, handing her what proved to be a letter. "I came to Silverdale when I received word of his death, too late for the funeral, but in time to discover something wasn't right about the mine collapse. The letter, written in the same hand as the correspondence Vivian had received, confirmed their relation and mentioned Daniel by name. It was dated just 2 weeks before the disaster. If you're his cousin, then you must be the bee mentioned in his journal," Vivian realized, connecting the pieces. "He wrote that evidence of some mining fraud was hidden where only you would know to look." Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "You read his journal that quickly?" "I'm a fast reader," Vivian replied, not entirely truthfully. "The important question is whether this mining fraud is connected to the men searching for me, or if we're caught between two separate dangerous situations." "Might be connected," Blackwood said thoughtfully. "Mining investments attract wealthy backers from back east, politicians included." A new possibility dawned on Vivian. Senator Preston has extensive investments in Western mining operations. It's detailed in my evidence against him. "Including here in Silverdale?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But if so, that would explain why his men tracked me here specifically." Blackwood paced the office, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Graham discovered someone was falsifying assay reports, claiming the silver was playing out, when it wasn't. The mine collapse happened 3 days after he threatened to expose the fraud." "You think it wasn't an accident," Vivian said, the implications chilling, "that someone deliberately caused the collapse to silence him?" 25 men died, Blackwood said quietly, a contained fury evident in his voice. "Good men with families, including Thomas, who was only in the mine that day because the foreman specifically requested him to examine a new vein." The pieces were beginning to align into a horrifying picture. "And now those responsible know I'm here, or at least suspect I might come here, because of possible connections to Senator Preston's investments. Which makes both of us targets," Blackwood concluded. "You for what you know about Preston, me for what Thomas might have told me about the mine fraud." Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the abandoned buildings of Silverdale with an eerie, mournful sound. In the distance, dark clouds gathered over the mountains, promising an approaching storm, both literal and figurative. "We need to find whatever evidence Thomas hid," Vivian said decisively, "and we need to leave Silverdale before those men return with reinforcements." Blackwood studied her with newfound respect. Most Eastern ladies would be swooning with fear by now. "I left swooning behind in Philadelphia," Vivian replied dryly, "along with any illusions about the protection offered by society or law when powerful men feel threatened." A hint of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Fair enough." He glanced toward the window, where the first raindrops had begun to spatter against the glass. "Storm's coming in fast. Mountain weather turns dangerous quick. We'll need to wait it out before we can travel safely." "Then we use this time to search for Thomas's evidence," Vivian suggested. "Where would he hide something?" "He wanted only you to find." Blackwood considered this, his expression thoughtful. "When we were boys, we had a secret place for messages. A hollow tree on our grandfather's farm. We'd leave notes for each other there when one of us was in trouble." Is there something similar here? A reference to your shared past? Maybe. Blackwood moved to the bookshelf, scanning the titles thoughtfully. Thomas always had a fondness for Thoreau. Said Walden reminded him of our summers at the lake. He pulled a volume from the shelf, a well-worn copy of Walden, and carefully opened it. The pages had been hollowed out, creating a small cavity within the book. Inside lay a folded document and a small key. "Clever Thomas," Blackwood murmured, unfolding the paper to reveal a detailed map of the North Star mine with one section circled in red ink. Handwritten notes in the margin detailed discrepancies between official assay reports and actual silver content from various sections. "This proves the fraud," Vivian said, studying the document, "but not who was behind it." "That's what the key is for," Blackwood replied, holding up the small brass key. "Thomas had a safe deposit box at the bank in Helena's Crossing. This must open it." The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof and windows with increasing fury. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing through the mountain valleys. "We won't be going anywhere until this passes," Blackwood observed grimly, "and neither will those riders. They'll be seeking shelter nearby." "How long do these mountain storms usually last?" Vivian asked, moving away from the window as lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the deserted street outside. "Hours, sometimes days, this time of year." Blackwood replaced the book on the shelf, tucking the map and key securely in his inner coat pocket. "We should return to the hotel. It's more defensible, and I have supplies there." As they prepared to brave the downpour for the short distance across the street, Vivian paused. "Mr. Blackwood, that wanted poster in your pocket. What crime are you accused of?" His dark eyes met hers steadily. "Murder of a federal judge in Denver. Crime I didn't commit." "Yet you don't seem particularly concerned about clearing your name," she observed. "Hard to clear your name when those who framed you control the courts," he replied. "Easier to stay ahead of the law until you find leverage to force the truth into the open." "Leverage like evidence of mining fraud that killed 25 innocent men?" Blackwood nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "You understand the game, Miss Montgomery." "All too well," she agreed solemnly. "It seems we both have powerful enemies and evidence that could destroy them. Making us temporary allies at the very least," Blackwood concluded, offering her his duster to shield her from the rain. "Ready?" Vivian accepted the coat, momentarily enveloped in its warmth and the lingering scent of tobacco and pine. "Ready?" They dashed across the muddy street, through sheets of driving rain, the hotel's covered porch offering welcome shelter before they entered the building. Inside, Blackwood immediately set about lighting lamps and stoking the fire in the lobby's large stone fireplace, the growing flames pushing back the damp chill that pervaded the abandoned structure. "There are supplies in the kitchen," he informed her, removing his sodden hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "I'll prepare something while you change into dry clothes." The simple domesticity of the suggestion struck Vivian as oddly comforting amid their precarious circumstances. She nodded gratefully and made her way upstairs to her room, where she changed into her only other dress, a practical grey cotton with minimal trimming that had served as her teaching uniform in Philadelphia. By the time she returned downstairs, Blackwood had assembled a surprisingly appetizing meal of beans, salt pork and biscuits, clearly made from preserved supplies. A pot of coffee bubbled on the stove, filling the room with its rich aroma. "You're quite resourceful, Mr. Blackwood," Vivian observed as she took a seat at the table he'd prepared. "Necessity," he replied, serving her a plate before taking his own seat. "Man on the run either learns to fend for himself or starves." They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, the storm raging outside, making the warm meal and shelter all the more appreciated. Finally, Vivian broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. If Thomas Graham was investigating fraud at the mine, and that investigation got him killed, why would he arrange for a mail-order bride to join him? Surely he must have suspected the danger. Blackwood considered the question, his expression thoughtful. His last letter to me mentioned wanting to start fresh somewhere else after resolving the situation here, said he had prospects for happiness he hadn't dared hope for. His dark eyes met hers across the table. I think he genuinely intended to marry you and leave Silverdale behind. The realization that Thomas Graham had indeed been sincere in his intentions brought an unexpected pang of loss for the life that might have been. A life now impossible in a town reduced to empty buildings and painful memories. "What will you do now, Miss Montgomery?" Blackwood asked. "After we weather this storm and retrieve whatever Thomas left in that safe deposit box?" It was the question Vivian had been avoiding since her arrival. With Thomas dead and Silverdale abandoned, her carefully constructed escape plan had crumbled to dust. "I cannot return east," she said definitively. "Senator Preston's reach is too extensive, and he won't rest until he recovers my evidence and eliminates the threat I represent." "The territories are large," Blackwood observed. "Many places a person could disappear." "Disappear and do what?" Vivian challenged. "I was a teacher in Philadelphia, Mr. Blackwood. My skills aren't particularly suited to survival on the frontier." A slight smile touched his lips. "You've shown more fortitude in our brief acquaintance than most seasoned frontiersmen I've known. Don't sell yourself short." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than the fire. "And what of you? Will you continue running?" As morning light filtered through the cracked windows of the Silverdale Hotel, Vivian Montgomery found herself studying the crude map Daniel Blackwood had spread across the lobby table. The storm had raged throughout the night, finally subsiding as dawn broke over the mountain peaks. Now they were planning their next move, while the muddy trails slowly dried under the emerging sun. "Helena's Crossing is here," Blackwood indicated, a settlement marked on the territorial map approximately 15 miles northeast of Silverdale. 2 days' journey on foot, given the conditions. Longer if we avoid the main trails, which would be wise. "And the men searching for us?" Vivian asked, sipping the strong coffee Blackwood had prepared. "Likely waiting at strategic points along the obvious routes," he replied, his finger tracing alternative paths through the mountainous terrain. "We'll need to stay off the established trails." Vivian considered this challenge, then posed the question that had been forming in her mind since dawn. "What if we don't leave Silverdale, at least not immediately?" Blackwood looked up sharply, surprise evident in his dark eyes. "You want to stay in a ghost town with armed men hunting us?" "They're already hunting us," she pointed out reasonably, "and they expect us to flee. What if instead we established ourselves here temporarily? Use this abandoned town as a base while we gather the evidence needed against both Senator Preston and whoever was behind the mine fraud." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound curiosity. "That's not a conventional approach, Miss Montgomery." "Conventional approaches haven't served me particularly well thus far," Vivian replied with a hint of irony. "Besides, this town has resources we could use. Shelter, some supplies, and most importantly, relative safety in its emptiness. No civilian bystanders to be endangered." "And what of the long term?" Blackwood challenged, though his tone suggested growing interest rather than dismissal. Silverdale was abandoned for good reasons. The mine collapse wasn't just a tragedy. It was the town's economic death sentence. Vivian rose from her chair and moved to the hotel's front window, gazing out at the deserted main street, now glistening with puddles from the night's rain. Perhaps, or perhaps the truth is more complex. Something in her voice must have intrigued Blackwood, for he joined her at the window, his imposing presence somehow reassuring rather than intimidating as it had been initially. "What are you thinking?" Thomas's journal mentioned discrepancies. In the assay reports, claims that the silver was playing out when his tests showed the opposite. Vivian turned to face him. What if the town wasn't abandoned because the mine failed, but because someone wanted people to believe it had? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he considered this possibility. A deliberate effort to clear the town so someone could claim the remaining silver without sharing profits. Or without witnesses to other activities, Vivian suggested. Senator Preston's investments extend beyond mining. He's involved in several ventures that operate in legal gray areas. Gambling establishments, certain imports of questionable legality. You think Silverdale might have been intended for some purpose beyond mining? I think it's worth investigating before we abandon it, Vivian replied, especially since your cousin died trying to uncover the truth. A new respect appeared in Blackwood's expression, not the reaction I expected from a Philadelphia schoolteacher. Former schoolteacher, Vivian corrected with a small smile, current fugitive and, apparently, aspiring detective. And what role would you assign me in this unorthodox investigation? Blackwood asked, a hint of amusement softening his normally stern features. Protection, expertise, and local knowledge, she replied promptly. Plus, your connection to Thomas provides motivation and potentially access to information I couldn't obtain alone. Blackwood considered her proposal silently, his gaze returning to the empty street outside. Finally, he nodded. 2 weeks. We investigate what happened here, retrieve whatever Thomas left in that bank box in Helena's Crossing, and determine our next steps. After that, we need a more permanent solution. Relief flooded through Vivian. The prospect of immediate departure from Silverdale had filled her with unexpected dread, not merely because of the dangers of travel, but because something about this ghost town had already begun to feel like an opportunity rather than a dead end. Agreed, she said, extending her hand to formalize their arrangement. After a moment's hesitation, Blackwood clasped it, his large hand engulfing hers in a firm but careful grip. We'll need supplies if we're staying, food, ammunition, tools. The general store, Vivian suggested, picked pretty clean, but there might be items overlooked in the hasty evacuation. He released her hand and reached for his hat. We should check the assay office more thoroughly, too. Thomas might have left other clues besides that map. As they stepped onto the hotel porch, the morning sun had risen fully above the eastern mountains, bathing Silverdale in golden light that belied its tragic emptiness. The muddy main street would need another few hours to dry sufficiently for comfortable exploration, but the day promised fair weather for their investigations. We should establish a signal, Blackwood said, as they prepared to separate for their respective tasks. In case of trouble, 3 quick shots means return to the hotel immediately. Vivian patted the pocket of her dress, where she kept her derringer. I'm afraid this only offers 2 shots. Without comment, Blackwood withdrew a revolver from his saddlebag and presented it to her, handle first. You know how to use one of these? My brother taught me the basics, she admitted, accepting the weapon with appropriate caution, though I've had limited practice. Keep it with you at all times, he instructed, watching as she tested its weight and checked the cylinder, as James had once shown her. And stay within sight of the hotel for now. Those men might have left scouts behind. They parted ways, Blackwood toward the livery stable, where he'd apparently established his base of operations, Vivian toward the general store to assess what supplies might remain. The simple domesticity of their tasks stood in stark contrast to the gravity of their situation, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the morning's activities. The general store, like most buildings in Silverdale, bore signs of hasty abandonment. Shelves had been partially cleared, leaving behind items deemed either too bulky or too insignificant to warrant precious space in departing wagons. Vivian found candles, some preserved foods, practical tools, and a supply of writing paper and ink, small treasures that would improve their temporary residence. As she gathered these items, a glint of metal caught her eye from beneath an overturned display case. Kneeling to investigate, she discovered a strongbox that had fallen and slid partially under a cabinet. The lock had broken in the fall, allowing her to easily open it. Inside lay the store's business records, invoices, order forms, and a ledger documenting transactions for the 6 months preceding Silverdale's abandonment. Vivian, trained in maintaining precise academic records at her Philadelphia school, immediately recognized inconsistencies in the entries. Certain supplies were being ordered in quantities far exceeding the needs of a town Silverdale's size. Particularly interesting were repeated orders for specialized chemicals, not unusual for a mining operation, but these had been delivered, not to the mine or assay office, but to a property listed simply as Warehouse 3 at the edge of town. Making a mental note to investigate this warehouse, Vivian continued her exploration of the store, eventually assembling a respectable collection of useful items. She was examining a shelf of medicinal supplies when a floorboard creaked behind her. Vivian whirled. The revolver Blackwood had given her instantly in hand, only to find the man himself standing in the doorway, eyebrows raised at her quick reaction. "Good instincts," he commented approvingly. "Though your stance needs work if you actually intend to hit anything." Relaxing slightly, Vivian lowered the weapon. "Did you find anything of interest at the livery?" "Horses," Blackwood replied unexpectedly. "2 of them left behind when they were deemed too old for the difficult journey out. They've been surviving on hay stored in the loft." The news delighted Vivian. "That solves our transportation problems, at least partially." "Indeed, I've given them water and the last of my oats." He crossed to examine her collection of supplies. "You've done well here. Anything noteworthy beyond the practical?" Vivian showed him the ledger and the curious orders for Warehouse 3. Blackwood's expression darkened as he reviewed the entries. "These chemicals," he said, pointing to specific items, "aren't for silver mining. They're used in processing gold ore, a completely different operation." "But I thought Silverdale was a silver mining town." "It was," Blackwood confirmed, "which makes these orders highly suspicious." Together they ventured to the town's edge, where 3 large warehouses stood in varying states of disrepair. Warehouse 3, the largest of them, featured heavy padlocks on its doors, far more security than the other structures. "Someone didn't want casual visitors," Blackwood observed, examining the locks. "Can you open them?" He gave her a sidelong glance that might have contained amusement. "Breaking and entering is still a crime, Miss Montgomery, even in a ghost town. As is fraud resulting in 25 deaths, she countered. "I believe the circumstances justify some investigative liberties." Without further comment, Blackwood withdrew tools from his coat and set to work on the locks. Within minutes, the heavy padlocks fell away, and the warehouse doors creaked open to reveal a cavernous space containing what appeared to be industrial equipment, partially disassembled and covered with tarpaulins. "That's not mining equipment," Blackwood stated, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "That's a gold processing operation designed to be portable." He strode to the nearest covered machine, pulling back the tarp to reveal intricate mechanisms. "Highly efficient, expensive, and completely unnecessary if you're mining silver." "Unless you're not just mining silver," Vivian surmised, pieces clicking into place. Could the North Star mine have had gold deposits as well? Deposits that someone wanted to keep secret? Gold discoveries can't be kept secret for long, Blackwood replied, continuing his examination of the equipment. Too many people involved, too much evidence in the ore itself. Unless those who knew are no longer able to tell, Vivian suggested quietly. Blackwood straightened, his expression grim. You're suggesting the mine collapse wasn't about silencing Thomas. It was about eliminating everyone who might have known about gold deposits. It would explain why someone went to such lengths to empty the town afterward. Spreading rumors of played-out silver veins and contaminated water ensured no one would return to investigate too closely. They spent the next hour thoroughly examining the warehouse, documenting their findings in Vivian's journal. The equipment was state-of-the-art, designed for efficient gold extraction on a significant scale. Most telling was a shipping manifest indicating the machinery had arrived just 2 months before the mine collapse, addressed to a company called Western Resource Development, a name that appeared nowhere in the town's official business registry. We need to check the other warehouses, Blackwood decided as they secured the building behind them, and the mine itself, though that will be more dangerous given the collapse. They had just reached Warehouse 2 when a sound froze them both in place, the distant but distinct rhythm of approaching horses. The riders from yesterday, Vivian whispered, returning with reinforcements. Blackwood's hand moved to his holster as he scanned the surrounding terrain. 3 men, coming fast from the East Trail, different direction than yesterday's group. Is there time to reach the hotel? He shook his head. They'd see us crossing the open street, this way. He guided her behind Warehouse 2 to a narrow passage between buildings that led toward the hillside behind the town. There's an old prospector's cabin up there, defensive position with good visibility. They moved swiftly through the muddy alleyways, Vivian hiking her skirts to keep pace with Blackwood's long strides. The terrain grew steeper as they ascended the hillside, loose shale making footing treacherous in places. Blackwood offered his, and at particularly difficult sections, his grip strong and sure as he helped her navigate the rough path. The prospector's cabin proved to be little more than a one-room structure built into the hillside, its construction taking advantage of natural rock formations for 2 of its walls, crude but solid, with a vantage point that overlooked the entire town below. We should be able to observe their movements from here, Blackwood said, positioning himself at the cabin's single window, though I doubt they're making a casual social call. Vivian joined him at the window, watching as 3 riders entered. Silverdale's main street, moving with the cautious precision of men expecting trouble. Their manner differed from the previous day's visitors, more professional, less overtly threatening, but somehow more dangerous for that very restraint. Not Preston's usual thugs, she observed. These men move like lawmen. Or experienced bounty hunters, Blackwood added grimly, likely looking for me rather than you. The wanted poster, Vivian recalled, for a murder you claim not to have committed. Judge Edgar Williams, Blackwood confirmed, eyes never leaving the men below as they dismounted outside the hotel. Found dead in his Denver chambers last October. I discovered the body, which naturally made me the prime suspect. But you were framed, Vivian stated, making it more confirmation than question. Judge Williams was investigating corruption in mining claims across the territory. We had arranged to meet that evening because he had uncovered evidence linking several prominent citizens to fraudulent operations. Blackwood's jaw tightened. When I arrived, he was already dead, throat cut. The murder weapon conveniently bore my finger marks, though I'd never seen it before. You fled rather than stand trial. Trial would have been a formality, he replied, bitterly. The prosecutor was among those the judge was investigating. Below, the 3 men had begun a methodical search of the buildings along the main street. Their professional approach confirmed Blackwood's assessment. These were experienced manhunters, not common thugs. They'll find evidence we've been here, Vivian noted. The supplies we gathered, the unlocked warehouse. Yes, Blackwood, agreed, which means we need a better plan than simply hiding and hoping they leave. Vivian studied the town layout from their elevated position, her mind working through possibilities. We have two advantages they don't: knowledge of what's truly happening here and the element of surprise. What are you suggesting? That we control the narrative, Vivian replied, an idea taking shape. If they believe they know why we're here, they'll respond accordingly, predictably. Blackwood turned from the window, giving her his full attention. Go on. These men are looking for a fugitive. Let's let them find evidence that you're after the rumored gold deposit, that you're here alone, using the abandoned town as a base while you search for wealth, not evidence of corruption. And what purpose would that serve? It would direct their attention away from the warehouses and Thomas's evidence toward the mine itself, Vivian explained. While they're searching the mine tunnels for you and the non-existent gold you're supposedly after, we can retrieve the contents of that safe deposit box in Helena's Crossing. A slow smile spread across Blackwood's face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, creating a diversion by playing to their expectations. Clever, Miss Montgomery. In teaching, I found the most disruptive students could be managed by redirecting their energy rather than confronting it directly, she replied with a modest shrug. Human nature doesn't change merely because the humans in question are carrying weapons. Education's loss is clearly my gain, Blackwood remarked, a newfound respect evident in his tone. How do we implement this strategy? Over the next hour, they formulated their plan, watching as the bounty hunters continued their systematic search of Silverdale. When the men entered the assay office, Vivian and Blackwood used the opportunity to circle behind them, returning to the hotel to gather essential supplies. They'll check the hotel next, Blackwood predicted, as they hastily packed food, ammunition, and Vivian's few belongings. We need to leave false evidence of my intentions, then make our way to the livery for the horses. Vivian tore pages from her journal, blank ones, not those containing evidence against Senator Preston, and used them to create a convincing facsimile of a treasure hunter's notes. Crude maps of the mine, calculations of possible gold deposits, and references to the mother lode, rumored to be hidden in the collapsed northern section. Ambitious, but disorganized, she explained as Blackwood watched her work with evident admiration. The kind of desperate scheming that would align with their perception of a wanted man hiding in a ghost town. You have unexpected talents, Miss Montgomery, he observed as she artfully scattered the forgeries around his room, making it appear he had departed in haste, leaving potentially valuable information behind. Necessity breeds adaptation, she replied, echoing his earlier sentiment. My brother always said I had a talent for understanding how people think, what motivates them, what blinds them to obvious truths. A valuable skill in our current circumstances. Blackwood gathered the last of their supplies. We should move now, while they're still examining the assay office. They slipped out through the hotel's back entrance, using outbuildings and alleyways to make their way to the livery stable without being spotted. The two horses Blackwood had mentioned, an aging chestnut gelding and a dappled mare, regarded them with mild interest as they entered the stable. They're not exactly prime mounts, Blackwood acknowledged as he quickly prepared them for riding, but they're sound enough for our purposes, which is reaching Helena's Crossing without being shot by bounty hunters, Vivian observed dryly, adjusting her skirts to accommodate horseback riding, a skill she'd fortunately acquired during childhood summers at her grandfather's country estate. Precisely, Blackwood agreed, helping her mount the mare before swinging onto the gelding. We'll take the western trail, circle north through the high country and approach Helena's crossing from the opposite direction our pursuers would expect. As they prepared to depart through the stable's rear door, shouts from the direction of the hotel confirmed their plan was working. The bounty hunters had discovered Blackwood's room and the misleading evidence they'd planted. "Perfect timing," Vivian whispered as they urged their mounts forward into the shelter of the pine forest that bordered Silverdale's western edge. "How long before they realize they've been misdirected?" "Long enough," Blackwood replied confidently. "Men who hunt for bounty think differently than men who hunt for truth. They'll follow the path of least resistance to their payday." They rode in silence for the next hour, climbing steadily into higher terrain where the previous night's storm had left the forest floor damp and their horses' hoofbeats muffled. Blackwood led them on game trails and narrow paths that showed his intimate knowledge of the region's geography. "You seem very familiar with these mountains for someone who wasn't raised here," Vivian observed during a brief rest to water the horses at a small stream. "Spent 5 years as a scout for the army before the war," Blackwood explained, scanning the trail behind them for any sign of pursuit. "Learned to read terrain, navigate without obvious trails. Useful skills for a man who later finds himself on the wrong side of the law." "Were you always on that side?" Vivian asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. "The wrong side of the law, I mean." Something like amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "Depends who's defining wrong, Miss Montgomery. I've never stolen except when starving, never killed except in self-defense or war." He adjusted his horse's girth strap with practiced ease. "But I've broken laws I found unjust and crossed men who believed themselves above accountability." "Men like whoever framed you for the judge's murder," she surmised. "Men like your Senator Preston," he countered. "Power corrupts, nowhere more evidently than in those who make and enforce the laws they themselves ignore." The sentiment aligned so perfectly with Vivian's own experience that she found herself nodding in agreement. Her brother James had believed in the system, trusted that evidence properly presented would bring justice regardless of a man's wealth or influence. That naivety had cost him his life. As they continued their journey, the mountain terrain grew, increasingly challenging. Their path took them through dense pine forests, across swift-running streams swollen with snowmelt, and along ridgelines that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. Despite the constant awareness of danger behind them, Vivian found herself marveling at the raw beauty of this untamed country. "It's magnificent," she breathed, during a momentary pause at a particularly spectacular viewpoint, the vast expanse of forest and mountain stretching to the horizon, so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets. "These mountains have a way of putting human concerns into perspective," Blackwood agreed, something softening in his normally guarded expression. "Makes a man's troubles seem smaller against such vastness." "Or a woman's," Vivian added with a small smile. They made camp as dusk approached, finding shelter in a natural cave formation that offered protection from both the elements and potentially watchful eyes. Blackwood demonstrated surprising consideration, ensuring Vivian had the more comfortable position near the small, smokeless fire he skillfully constructed. As they shared a simple meal of jerky and biscuits, Vivian found herself studying her unexpected companion in the flickering firelight. The wanted poster had depicted him as a dangerous criminal, yet she had witnessed only competence, intelligence, and a certain gruff courtesy in their brief acquaintance. "You're staring, Miss Montgomery," Blackwood observed without looking up, from the coffee he was preparing. "Forgive me," she replied, not particularly contrite. "I'm attempting to reconcile the man described by that wanted poster with the one sharing this cave." "And your assessment?" He handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. Vivian accepted it gratefully, warming her hands around the metal. That justice and law are not always aligned, Mr. Blackwood. A lesson I've learned at considerable personal cost. A dangerous perspective for a schoolteacher, he noted. Former schoolteacher, she corrected. Current fugitive from powerful men who would see me silenced. She sipped her coffee, finding its bitterness oddly comforting. Not unlike yourself, it seems. Blackwood's expression remained unreadable in the dim light. Circumstances have made us unlikely allies, Miss Montgomery, but temporary ones. Once we retrieve Thomas's evidence, our paths should diverge for safety's sake. Because you believe your presence endangers me? Vivian asked, more disappointed by this statement than she cared to admit. Two targets together make an easier mark than two separated, he replied practically, and your enemies are not mine. Yet they seem increasingly connected, she pointed out. Senator Preston's investments, the fraudulent mine operation that killed your cousin. These threads appear to be part of the same corrupt tapestry. Blackwood considered this, absently tracing the scar along his jawline, a gesture Vivian had noticed he made when deep in thought. Perhaps, but my priority remains clearing my name and bringing justice for Thomas and the other miners. Your evidence against Preston is your own battle. A battle I'm ill-equipped to win alone, Vivian admitted. Senator Preston has resources, connections, and men willing to kill on his command. What do I have beyond documents he'll claim are forgeries? Courage, Blackwood replied simply. Intelligence, determination. I've seen men with arsenals at their disposal who possessed less formidable weapons than those. The unexpected compliment caught Vivian off guard, warming her more effectively than the fire or coffee. Before she could formulate a response, Blackwood rose to his feet. You should rest, he said, his tone once again businesslike. I'll take first watch. We'll reach Helena's Crossing by midday tomorrow if we start at dawn. As Vivian settled onto the bedroll Blackwood had provided, her mind continued to work through their complicated situation. Two fugitives with evidence against powerful men, temporarily aligned by circumstance and mutual need. Logic dictated they should indeed separate once their immediate goals were achieved. Yet something beyond logic made the prospect unexpectedly unwelcome. Sleep eventually claimed her, the physical and emotional exhaustion of recent days overwhelming even her active thoughts. She dreamed of Silverdale, not as the abandoned ghost town she'd found, but as it might have been. Buildings restored, streets busy with commerce, children playing near a schoolhouse where she taught, and standing beside her through it all, a tall figure whose face remained in shadow but whose presence felt inexplicably right. Dawn broke with misty tendrils of fog curling through the pine trees, creating an ethereal landscape as they prepared to depart. Blackwood, who had eventually awakened Vivian for her turn at watch during the night, moved with the slightly stiff motions of a man who had spent too many hours in vigilant stillness. No sign of pursuit, he reported as they saddled the horses. But Helena's Crossing will present new challenges. It's a functioning settlement with a sheriff, telegraph office, and citizens who might recognize either of us from descriptions circulated. We'll need disguises then, Vivian suggested practically, or at least alterations to our appearance. Blackwood nodded approvingly. There's a trading post about 2 miles from town where miners and trappers stop before entering more civilized areas. We might find what we need there. They rode through morning mist that gradually burned away beneath a strengthening sun, revealing a landscape transitioning from the higher, rocky terrain of Silverdale to more gentle, rolling foothills. Wildflowers had begun to carpet meadows with splashes of color, a stark contrast to the ghost town's grey emptiness. The trading post proved to be a ramshackle but well-stocked establishment operated by an elderly man with a magnificent white beard and apparently limited interest in his customers' identities. For a modest sum, they acquired a battered, wide-brimmed hat for Vivian, a plain work shirt and trousers that might allow her to pass as a young man from a distance, and a trail-worn duster for Blackwood that differed significantly from the one described in his wanted poster. Simple but effective, Blackwood approved as Vivian emerged from behind a stack of flour barrels where she'd changed into her disguise, her chestnut hair tucked beneath the hat. "You make a convincing young prospector, though anyone looking closely would still see a woman." "Then we'll ensure no one looks too closely," she replied, adjusting the unfamiliar trousers. The freedom of movement they allowed was revelatory after years constrained by proper feminine attire. "What's our approach to the bank?" "Direct but cautious," Blackwood decided. "I'll enter first, assess the situation. You'll follow several. Minutes later, we'll conduct our business separately, but depart together if all goes well." The plan was simple but sound, minimizing their time together in public while ensuring neither would be left vulnerable alone. As they approached Helena's crossing, Vivian felt a curious mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. For all the danger of their situation, there was something undeniably liberating about shedding the constraints of her former life, however temporarily. Helena's crossing proved to be a thriving settlement, substantially larger than Silverdale had been, boasting a proper main street with boardwalks, a two-story hotel, several saloons, and the numerous businesses required to service the surrounding mining operations. Most importantly, it featured a solid brick building with First Territorial Bank emblazoned across its facade. They separated at the town's edge as planned, Blackwood proceeding directly to the bank, while Vivian waited the agreed-upon interval, using the time to observe the town's rhythm and note potential escape routes should their presence be discovered. When she finally entered the bank, Blackwood was nowhere in sight, either already in a private room with a bank official or departed after finding reason for concern. The latter possibility sent a ripple of anxiety through her, but she maintained her composure as she approached the teller's window. "I need access to a safe deposit box," she stated in the lower register she'd practiced, presenting the small brass key they'd found in Thomas's hollowed-out book. "It belongs to my late employer, Mr. Thomas Graham, of Silverdale." The teller, a young man with spectacles and a somewhat nervous demeanor, examined the key briefly. "Of course, sir, His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked more closely at Vivian, uncertainty evident in his expression. "My employer's instructions were explicit," Vivian continued before he could comment on her gender, adopting a tone of brisk efficiency. "As his clerk, I'm to retrieve specific documents following his unfortunate passing." Yes, of course," the teller replied, apparently deciding it wasn't his place to question a customer's business or appearance. "If you'll follow me to the private viewing room, I'll retrieve the box for you." The viewing room proved to be a small chamber with a solid door and a single table. To Vivian's relief, Blackwood was already there, engaged in conversation with an older bank official. They acknowledged each other with the briefest of nods, maintaining their pretense of being unacquainted. Minutes later, both men departed, leaving Vivian alone with Thomas Graham's safe deposit box, a rectangular metal container approximately the size of a large book. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key and lifted the lid. Inside lay several documents, neatly bundled with string, a small leather pouch that clinked softly when she lifted it, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To my bride." Vivian's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope addressed, "To my bride." Inside was a letter written in the familiar handwriting of Thomas Graham, dated just 1 week before the mine collapse that claimed his life. "My dear Miss Montgomery," it began, "if you are reading this, then circumstances have prevented our meeting as planned. I pray it is merely delay rather than tragedy that separates us. but I am a practical man who recognizes the dangers of the path I now walk." The letter continued, detailing Graham's discovery of the fraudulent assay reports and his growing certainty that the Silverdale mine contained not just silver, but a significant gold deposit that certain powerful investors were attempting to claim exclusively for themselves. "I have documented their scheme in the enclosed papers," he wrote. "Names, dates, falsified reports alongside my accurate findings. Most damning is proof that the mine manager Edward Holloway was bribed to declare the silver played out while preparations were made to extract the gold secretly after the town's abandonment." Vivian quickly examined the accompanying documents, finding exactly what Thomas had described: meticulous records of corruption that implicated not only local officials, but several prominent Denver businessmen. And on the final page, a name that sent a chill through her: William Preston, Senator, Pennsylvania, listed as a major silent investor in Western Resource Development, the same company name they'd found on the warehouse equipment. The letter's final paragraphs struck a more personal note. "I have looked forward to our meeting with genuine anticipation, finding in your letters a kindred spirit and intelligence I had not dared hope to discover in this remote country. Should fate deny us our intended future, please know that I considered our correspondence one of life's unexpected blessings." He had signed it simply, Thomas, followed by a postscript. "The enclosed pouch contains your wedding ring and funds sufficient for your return journey east, should you choose that path." Vivian opened the leather pouch, finding a simple gold band and several banknotes totaling $200. Indeed enough for an eastbound ticket and expenses. The thoughtfulness of this provision from a man she'd never met brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Before she could examine the remaining documents, a soft knock at the door preceded Blackwood's return. His expression was tense as he closed the door firmly behind him. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Now." "What's happened?" "Bounty hunters just rode into town. Different men than those at Silverdale, but looking for the same fugitives. A wanted man and a woman traveling together." Vivian quickly gathered the documents, securing them inside her shirt. "Did they see you?" "No, but they're showing my likeness around, along with a description of you that's uncomfortably accurate." His dark eyes met hers. "They're offering substantial rewards for information." "The back exit?" "Watched," Blackwood replied grimly. "We're temporarily trapped here, but the bank manager owes Thomas a favor. He's arranged a diversion and alternative departure in 5 minutes." Those 5 minutes stretched interminably as they listened to movements in the bank beyond their door, customers conducting routine business, unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Finally, a sharp knock signaled their cue. The bank manager himself, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and shrewd eyes, opened the door just enough to speak in hushed tones. "The freight wagon leaving for Miller's Creek is parked behind the bank. Driver's been paid to take on 2 passengers without questions. Go now, while those men are occupied at the telegraph office." Blackwood clasped the man's hand briefly. Thomas would be grateful. "Thomas Graham was a good man," the manager replied solemnly. "Unlike those who arranged his death. Go, and be careful. This goes beyond local corruption." They slipped out through the bank's service entrance, quickly making their way to the waiting freight wagon. The driver, a weathered man who acknowledged them only with a terse nod, had created a small hidden compartment among his cargo of mining supplies. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but offered effective concealment as they rumbled out of Helena's crossing. Only when they were several miles from town did the driver signal it was safe to emerge. "Name's Porter," he introduced himself as they settled onto the wagon bench beside him. "Don't know what trouble you're in, and don't want to know. Dropping you at the Miller's Creek crossroads as arranged." "We appreciate your discretion," Vivian replied, adjusting her hat which had been crushed during their concealment. "Way I see it, anyone Chester Montgomery wants to help deserves it," Porter replied, referring to the bank manager. "Man's judgment is solid as the gold in his vault." They travelled in silence for several miles, the wagon's steady progress carrying them farther from immediate danger, but toward an increasingly uncertain future. Finally, Vivian withdrew Thomas's letter and the accompanying documents. "Senator Preston is directly connected to the Silverdale fraud," she told Blackwood, showing him the relevant pages. "He's an investor in the company that installed that gold processing equipment." Blackwood studied the evidence, his expression darkening. "And the same company employed the mine manager who falsified reports about the silver playing out." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Your corrupt senator and my cousin's killers are indeed the same people. Which means our separate paths have converged more permanently than we anticipated," Vivian observed. "So it would appear." Blackwood fell silent for several moments, clearly weighing their limited options. "We need a safe location to review all this evidence properly and formulate a plan, somewhere neither bounty hunters nor Preston's men would think to look." "Silverdale," Vivian suggested immediately. "We've already established it as our base, and now we know why it was abandoned. The town itself is evidence of the crime." "It's also the first place they'll look for us," Blackwood countered. "Not if they believe we've fled elsewhere," Vivian argued. "Your false trail worked once. We could lay another, more convincing one." Porter, who had been silently driving during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Might I suggest an alternative? My brother runs a hunting cabin 20 miles north of Silverdale, remote, defensible, unknown to most folks. You'd be welcome to use it while you sort out your troubles." The unexpected offer surprised them both. Porter shrugged at their questioning looks. Chester explained enough. If Thomas Graham was murdered over this business, justice needs serving. "My brother and I fought for the Union. We believe in standing against corruption." "That's a generous offer, Mr. Porter," Vivian said warmly. "Nothing generous about opposing murder and theft," he replied matter-of-factly. "Just doing what any decent man would." "We accept with gratitude," Blackwood decided after a brief silent exchange with Vivian, "but we'll need to return to Silverdale first to retrieve evidence from the warehouses." Porter nodded. "I'll take you as close as the old logging road, safer than approaching directly from Helena's Crossing." As the wagon rumbled onward, Vivian found herself studying the documents from Thomas's safe deposit box more carefully. Beyond the evidence of fraud and corruption, she discovered something unexpected: architectural drawings for a substantial structure labeled processing facility that appeared far more elaborate than necessary for standard mining operations. "Look at these dimensions," she said to Blackwood, showing him the plans. "This isn't merely for processing ore, it's almost the size of a factory." Blackwood examined the drawings with growing concern. "And these special reinforcements, the isolated power supply, this resembles a government facility more than a private operation." What would Senator Preston want with such a facility in an abandoned mining town? Vivian wondered aloud. "Something that requires secrecy, isolation, and deniability," Blackwood replied grimly, "none of which bodes well for legitimate purposes." By late afternoon, they had reached the logging road Porter had mentioned, an overgrown trail that would lead them within a few miles of Silverdale from the northwestern approach, a direction unlikely to be watched by pursuers expecting them to travel east from Helena's Crossing. "My brother's cabin is here," Porter explained, marking a crude map he'd drawn for them. "Name's Edward Porter. Mention me and he'll provide whatever help he can. Good luck to you both. Sounds like you'll need it." With renewed supplies from Porter and a clearer understanding of what they were investigating, Vivian and Blackwood set off on foot towards Silverdale. The journey would take them through dense forest and challenging terrain, but offered excellent concealment from searching eyes. "What's our plan once we reach Silverdale?" Vivian asked as they established a steady pace along the faint trail. "Merely gathering evidence seems insufficient given the scale of corruption we're uncovering." "First, we document everything," Blackwood replied. "The warehouses, the equipment, the mine itself, if we can safely access it. Then we identify exactly what they were planning to build there." He glanced at her, his expression resolute. "With sufficient evidence, we might approach territorial officials directly, circumventing the corrupted local authorities. And if territorial officials are also compromised," Vivian challenged, "Senator Preston's influence extends far." "Then we find a newspaper editor with courage," Blackwood suggested. "Truth published becomes harder to bury than truth merely whispered." The strategy had merit, Vivian had to admit. Her brother James had considered a similar approach before his murder, though he had hesitated too long, placing too much faith in proper channels of justice. They made camp as dusk approached, finding shelter in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. Blackwood efficiently constructed a nearly smokeless fire while Vivian organized their supplies. The domestic routine they established had become almost comfortable in its familiarity, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had thrown them together. "You mentioned your brother taught you to shoot," Blackwood said, as they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. "Was he in law enforcement?" "James was Senator Preston's private secretary," Vivian replied, the pain of his loss still evident in her voice, despite the months that had passed. He believed in the senator's public platform of reform and progress. When he discovered the corruption behind the facade, it destroyed his idealism. "Yet he gathered evidence rather than simply resigning," Blackwood observed. "James believed in justice above all," Vivian said softly. "He couldn't walk away once he knew the truth, even understanding the risks." She met Blackwood's gaze across the small fire. "Not unlike your cousin Thomas, it seems. Good men often underestimate the lengths to which corrupt men will go to protect their interests," Blackwood replied, a personal bitterness evident in his tone. "Thomas was brilliant but idealistic. He believed evidence properly presented would compel justice, as did James." Vivian stared into the flames, remembering her brother's conviction that truth would prevail. His body was found hanged in his apartment, an apparent suicide, complete with a note confessing to embezzlement from the senator's accounts, a crime he never committed. "I'm sorry," Blackwood said simply, the words carrying genuine empathy, rather than mere politeness. "They were thorough in their framing," Vivian continued, "but not thorough enough to discover he had already shared his findings with me, anticipating he might be silenced." The conversation lapsed into contemplative silence, each reflecting on the loved ones whose deaths had set them on their current paths. Despite their different origins, Vivian from Philadelphia society, Blackwood from a more complex and clearly dangerous past, they shared a common purpose in seeking justice for those who could no longer seek it themselves. As night deepened, around their small camp, Vivian found herself drawing unexpected comfort from Blackwood's presence. A man society had labeled dangerous outlaw had proven to be her most reliable ally in a world where badges and political office too often concealed the true criminals. "We should reach Silverdale by midday tomorrow," Blackwood noted as he banked the fire for the night. "I'll take first watch." "Wake me for the second," Vivian insisted. "You need rest as much as I do." He nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. 4 hours then." When Blackwood gently roused her for her turn at watch, Vivian found herself unexpectedly alert despite the brief rest. The mountain night was alive with sounds, the soft hooting of owls, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures moving through underbrush. She positioned herself against a tree trunk, Blackwood's revolver across her lap, and kept vigil as he slept. In the stillness, her thoughts returned to the letter from Thomas Graham. His words suggested a man of principle and kindness, qualities she had sought in a potential husband when answering his advertisement. How strange that fate had instead partnered her with Daniel Blackwood, a man as far removed from her original expectations as could be imagined, yet one whose courage and integrity were becoming increasingly apparent beneath his rough exterior. Dawn brought clearing skies and renewed determination. They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal trace of their presence, and continued toward Silverdale. As Blackwood had predicted, they reached the ridge overlooking the ghost town shortly after midday. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Silverdale was no longer deserted. Half a dozen wagons were parked along the main street, and men moved purposefully between buildings carrying equipment and supplies. At the warehouses they had investigated, increased activity suggested the unloading of additional machinery. "They're accelerating their plans," Blackwood observed grimly as they lay prone on the ridge, using his spyglass to study the activity below. "Whatever they intend to build here, our investigation has clearly prompted them to move faster." "Can you identify any of them?" Vivian asked, accepting the spyglass when he offered it. "Not from this distance," he replied. "But their organization suggests professionals rather than common outlaws or opportunists." Vivian focused the spyglass on a well-dressed man who appeared to be directing operations from the hotel porch. Something about his bearing struck her as familiar, though she couldn't immediately place him. "We need a closer look," she decided, lowering the spyglass. "And we need to retrieve whatever evidence remains in the warehouses before they dismantle or destroy it." "Approaching directly would be suicide," Blackwood cautioned. "They're armed and clearly expecting trouble." "Then we don't approach." "Directly," Vivian replied, an idea forming as she studied the layout of the town. The mine connects to Warehouse 3 via a narrow-gauge rail system for transporting ore. Thomas's map showed secondary tunnels that might allow us to enter undetected. Blackwood considered this, weighing the considerable risks against their dwindling alternatives. The tunnels would be dangerous, potentially unstable after the collapse, but it might be our only option for gathering the evidence we need. They circled wide around the town, approaching the mine entrance from the densely forested northern slope, where they would be shielded from observation. The main entrance had indeed collapsed, as reported, but a secondary access tunnel, likely used for ventilation and emergency egress, remained partially open, though clearly unstable. "Stay close," Blackwood instructed as they prepared to enter, lighting a small lantern he'd brought from their supplies. "Step exactly where I step, and be ready to move quickly if you hear any shifting above." The tunnel was cramped and oppressive, requiring them to proceed in a half-crouch through sections where support beams had partially failed. The air grew thick with dust, and the lingering scent of blasting powder making breathing laborious as they ventured deeper into the mountain. Vivian fought against rising claustrophobia, focusing instead on following Blackwood's steady progress ahead of her. The knowledge that 25 men had died in these tunnels made each step feel like traversing a grave, which in many ways it was. After what seemed an interminable journey through progressively deteriorating passages, they reached a junction where the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Mining equipment lay abandoned exactly as it had been left the day of the collapse, creating an eerie tableau of interrupted industry. "The main collapse was 2 chambers ahead," Blackwood explained quietly, holding the lantern higher to illuminate the space. "But this area has been disturbed recently." He was right. While dust covered most surfaces, there were clear tracks. Through it, boot prints and dragged equipment creating pathways that shouldn't exist in a truly abandoned mine. "Someone's been working here," Vivian observed, "recently and extensively." They followed the disturbances deeper into the mine, eventually discovering a section where new support beams had been installed and debris cleared away, creating a passageway where the original tunnel had partially collapsed. Beyond this reinforced section lay something entirely unexpected, a large chamber that appeared to have been deliberately excavated, with fresh tool marks on the walls and ceiling. "This isn't mining," Blackwood said, his voice tight with contained anger. "They're creating a hidden underground facility." The chamber connected to several newly dug tunnels, each heading in different directions beneath Silverdale. One, according to their orientation, would lead approximately toward Warehouse 3, as Vivian had suggested. What could they possibly be constructing that requires such secrecy? Vivian wondered, documenting the chamber's dimensions and features. In her journal, "Nothing legitimate," Blackwood replied grimly. "The question is whether we can gather enough evidence to expose it before they realize we've discovered their operation." They chose the tunnel that appeared to lead toward the warehouse, moving as quickly as caution would allow. The passage was better constructed than the original mine tunnels, with proper bracing and even rudimentary rail tracks for small transport carts. After several hundred yards, they encountered a heavy wooden door, locked, but yielding to Blackwood's skills after a tense minute of manipulation. Beyond lay a crude elevator system clearly designed to connect the underground chambers with the warehouse above. "We've found their supply route," Vivian whispered. "They can move equipment and materials in through the warehouses, then down to whatever they're building beneath the town, completely hidden from outside observation." "Ingenious and concerning," Blackwood agreed, examining the mechanism. "This elevator was recently used. We need to be extremely cautious moving forward." They ascended via a ladder built into the shaft wall, rather than risking noise from the elevator mechanism. At the top, another door opened into what they recognized as the rear storage area of Warehouse 3. From beyond came the sounds of men working, voices calling instructions, the clang of metal on metal, crates being moved across wooden floors. Blackwood motioned for absolute silence as they crept to a position where they could observe without being seen. The main warehouse floor had been transformed into an organized operation, with the equipment they'd previously discovered now being prepared for installation. More concerning were the new arrivals, specialized machinery whose purpose wasn't immediately evident, but suggested technological sophistication beyond standard mining operations. The well-dressed man Vivian had observed from the ridge stood in the center of this activity, inspecting a large crate whose contents appeared to particularly interest him. As he turned to speak to a foreman, Vivian stifled a gasp of recognition. "Senator Harrison," she whispered, identifying one of Preston's closest political allies and fellow members of the Commerce Committee. "He's supposed to be in Washington." Blackwood's expression hardened. "His presence confirms the government connection we suspected. This isn't merely a private criminal enterprise." As they watched, Senator Harrison consulted what appeared to be architectural plans similar to those they'd found in Thomas's safe deposit box. He gestured toward the elevator shaft, clearly discussing the underground construction with his foreman. "We've seen enough," Blackwood decided, gently pulling Vivian back from their observation point. "We need to document this connection and get the evidence to someone who can act on it." They retreated as carefully as they had advanced, returning to the mine tunnels and beginning the tense journey back to the surface. The evidence they now possessed, Thomas Graham's documentation, their own observations, and the direct connection to Senator Harrison, represented a significant threat to powerful figures who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. As they neared the mine entrance, a distant rumble froze them in place. For a terrifying moment, Vivian feared another collapse, but Blackwood's expression suggested a different concern. "Explosives," he said tersely. "Controlled detonation. They're expanding the underground chambers. The vibration subsided, allowing them to continue their careful exit. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, the fresh air a welcome relief after the mine's oppressive atmosphere. Using the forest for cover, they circled around to retrieve the horses they had hidden earlier. "We need to reach Porter's brother and his cabin," Blackwood said as they mounted. "Document everything we've seen while it's fresh in our minds, then determine how to proceed." Vivian nodded in agreement, though her thoughts had already moved beyond mere documentation. "What we've uncovered goes beyond fraud or even murder," she said, as they guided their horses through the dense forest, maintaining maximum distance from Silverdale. "They're constructing something secret with government involvement, but outside official channels, that suggests. Activities they can't risk exposing to public or congressional scrutiny," Blackwood finished, "which means we're now threats to something far larger than we initially understood." The realization should have been terrifying, yet Vivian felt a curious calm descend. The stakes had risen dramatically, but so too had the importance of their mission. This was no longer merely about personal justice for Thomas Graham or James Montgomery. It had expanded into a matter of public interest that transcended individual grievances. As they rode northward toward the promised safety of Edward Porter's cabin, a plan began to form in Vivian's mind. One that might offer not only justice, but also a future neither of them had dared imagine when fate first brought them together. In an abandoned town that it now appeared was far from truly deserted. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice steady with newfound purpose, "I believe I may have a proposal that serves both our interests while addressing the larger threat we've uncovered." He glanced at her, curiosity evident in his expression. "I'm listening, Miss Montgomery." "It involves returning to Silverdale," she continued, "but not as fugitives or mere gatherers of evidence." "As what, then?" A determined smile touched Vivian's lips. "As its new proprietors. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.